Here at the German Institute of Global and Area Studies, my co-author Sandra Destradi and I have been working on India and Indian foreign policy a lot. At the same time, we've been following debates around the rise of populist forces across the globe, and we think that the current Indian government under Prime Minister Narendra Modi is an interesting part of this trend. Now, there's a lot of exciting literature on populism and its causes out there, and this has been reinforced, obviously, by the headlines produced by Trump and his administration, as well as European cases from Italy, Austria, Hungary to Poland, and so on. And when going through the literature, we found that there were only very few studies on populism and foreign policy in particular, and the ones we found were mostly focused on Western cases. So one of the reasons for this, we think, is the simple fact that outside Latin America, until recently, populists have been in power rarely and hence not been responsible for actual foreign policy making. But another reason for the lack of literature on populism and foreign policy may well be that populism often is understood as inward-looking, as an inward-looking political ideology or strategy. In any case, we thought that looking into Narendra Modi and the conduct of his foreign policy in India since coming to office in 2014 would be an interesting exercise in examining what kind of foreign policy populists in power actually pursue. And besides the fact that Modi is a particularly good fit to the definition of populism we employ, we also think that the Indian case is helpful in that it allows us to compare a populist incumbent with a non-populist predecessor government under Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. So in the paper, we first reviewed the conceptual literature on populism, in particular works by Mudde, Rovira Kaltwasser, and others who understand populism as a thin ideology, typically coexisting with a thick ideology such as socialism, nationalism, or in the Indian case, Hindu nationalism. And understood in this way, populism is defined by two integral elements, anti-elitism and anti-pluralism. From these core features follow a range of demands that one can trace in populist discourses. For instance, calls for a radical break with the past, a disdain for the media, and in fact, any other institution intermediating between the populist leader and his people. Another typical element is victimization. The true people are victims to a predatory elite or other societal elements not understood as being part of the true people. And with this definition at hand, we then developed a set of hypotheses for our empirical work on India to find out more about, about our precise reasoning for each of these hypotheses. You'll have to have a look at the paper. Here I can only say that each of it was meant to reflect both of the core elements I mentioned earlier, anti-elitism and anti-pluralism. So those five exploratory, really, hypotheses are, first, populists in power will be less likely to make concessions on global governance issues that entail high costs of blood and treasure as compared to non-populist governments. Second, populists in power are likely to privilege bilateralism over multilateralism. Third, populists in power will be more likely than their non-populist counterparts to develop a transnational understanding of their people and to engage such a transnational audience in their foreign policy. Right? That's a particularly exploratory hypothesis, really. Fourth, the decision-making process in the foreign policy of populists in power will be more centralized and personalistic, with fewer formalized opportunities for alternative viewpoints than under a non-populist leadership. And finally, populists in power will be more likely to adopt unconventional ways of directly relating their foreign policy to the people, including in particular, and obviously via social media. So in the paper then, we proceed with a section on populism in India, which is a fascinating field of historical research that I cannot go into here. Let me instead now go through our findings, namely in how far the Modi government fulfilled the expectations circumscribed by our five hypotheses. Anyone acquainted with Indian foreign policy will be aware of the high level of continuity across time and governments. The Modi government, despite its comfortable majority in parliament and sometimes bombastic rhetoric, is no exception to that. And foreign policy changes were anything but radical. That's a background one should be aware of when going through the hypothesis. Now, with regard to the first expectation of global governance and public goods, we found that Modi, if anything, has been more willing to contribute than his predecessor. This was illustrated, for instance, by India's relatively constructive support to the Paris Climate Accord. Neither did we find the Modi government substantially less inclined to engage in multilateralism, although Modi himself sometimes emphasizes his personal bonds with some world leaders. More interesting were our findings regarding the third, fourth, and fifth hypotheses. The Modi government, for instance, was remarkably active in diaspora politics. Speeches to the Indian diaspora have become a central element of foreign visits by the Prime Minister, and Indian embassies also have been attributed specific funds to cultivate ties with the diaspora. Another characteristic of the current government's foreign policy is a centralization of its decision-making process, in some cases circumventing the traditionally very dominant Ministry of External Affairs, including the minister herself. So on this fourth hypothesis, we also found confirmative evidence. And finally, the Modi government, including its foreign policy apparatus, has been at the forefront of employing social media. Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj has been particularly active in responding to individual grievances of Indians abroad via Twitter and other social media. And all of this happened against the background of a profound distrust by the government vis-a-vis the established media, and English language media in particular. For instance, Modi ended the long-standing practice of Indian journalists accompanying the Prime Minister on his plane on visits abroad. Now, what do we make of these findings? We think that the case of India tells us that populism does not have much of an immediate impact on the substance of foreign policy, but it certainly has important consequences for the style and the processes of foreign policy making. With regard to substance, intervening factors are important. For instance, India's role in international institutions is regarded as a still inadequate symbol of the global status India aspires to. And involvement in, as well as financial contributions to international institutions, are limited when compared to European cases or the US. So that may be one factor that explains why Modi, despite being a populist, has not been overtly critical of international institutions. Yet we also think that in the long run, foreign policy style and procedures will impact upon substance. And it may well be that through procedural changes, a populist's thick ideology, Hindu nationalism in the Indian case, grows in importance for the conduct of foreign policy over time. And we thus conclude by suggesting to look into the precise consequences of personalization, centralization, and communication of populist foreign policy in future research on India, and importantly also compare it in a comparative way beyond India. Right. Right, very interesting. I think, first of all, our paper tells us that there's a variety of populists and populist foreign policies out there. With regard to Western cases, our analysis suggests that the existent involvement in international institutions, such as the European Union, but also NAFTA, matters a great deal. For populists in the Global South, there's no, as I said earlier, no comparable degree of involvement. Hence, scapegoating international institutions is less of an option. However successful it may be as a strategy in the European context. Another point I'd like to mention goes back to the centralization and personalization part of foreign policy that I emphasized earlier. Populists of all stripes regard themselves as embodying the will of the people, whatever people they mean by this. So centralization comes natural, including in foreign policy. Now, one should also say that this is a process that's not, so centralization is a process that's not exclusive to populists in power, of course. Instead, foreign policy has become ever more a matter of heads of states and governments rather than foreign ministers, for instance, across regimes and states. But populists not only centralize, they also seek to personalize foreign policy. And with this comes the question of effectiveness. I think that's an important question. With populists in power in the US and worldwide, one must wonder to what extent they can really fulfill the expectations they raise. After all, foreign policy in a globalized world, in a integrated world, is comprised of a broad range of themes and relationships, which an overly centralized and personalized decision-making process perhaps is not capable of covering. Also, when you think of personalization as a factor that reinforces populist thick ideologies and their role in foreign policy making, one must first look into those precise thick ideologies, but one must also consider sort of the sources of these thick ideologies. In many instances, they have a long history and they come from different times, perhaps, or even though they're certainly being adapted. And one wonders whether they really are capable of covering the complex nature of today's foreign relations. So in that sense, foreign policy may become more monodimensional, less complex perhaps, as a result of populists' rise to power. And also, perhaps as a last point, it will be interesting to look into how far populists actually contribute to the politicization of foreign policy by way of their style of communication. I think indications are that this is the case, but there's very little research on this, and it's also something we sort of can monitor live at the moment. Related to this is the question how populists engage with each other. Their style makes diplomatic compromises a difficult sell in many ways. And here in Europe also, we've already seen some incidents in which populist foreign policies have clashed, despite their professed solidarity on the EU level. That's also something that's going to be interesting to look at.